wind didn't just howl, it screamed. It was a high, thin sound that scoured the pines and drove the snow sideways, piling it in drifts that buried the world. Night had fallen hours ago, though in this part of the Montana wilderness, in the dead of 1888, the sun was just a weak memory. Inside the small, snowbound cabin, the man was unmoved. He had built this place with his own hands, chinking the logs tight against the very storm that now tried to tear them apart. His name was Elias. Though he hadn't heard it spoken aloud in nearly 2 years, he lived with the sound of the wind, the crackle of his fire, and the steady, heavy silence of his own thoughts. He was a tall man, broad in the shoulders but worn thin, as if life had whittled him down to the hard parts. A scar, white and puckered, ran from his temple into his beard. He sat on a low stool, the firelight catching the gray in his hair as he methodically worked grease into a leather harness strap. The cabin was sparse: a cot, a table, 2 chairs, and a cold iron stove that served for cooking. It was enough. It was quiet. The storm was his only companion, and he understood its language. He knew the sound of a branch snapping under the weight of ice, the deep whoomp of snow sliding off the roof. That is why the new sound stopped him. It was faint, almost swallowed by the gale. A tap, tap, tap. Elias froze. His hand tightened on the leather. He tilted his head, listening past the wind's shriek. Nothing. He must have imagined it. No man and no animal would be out on a night like this. This was not weather for the living. He returned to his work, rubbing the tallow in slow circles. Tap, tap, tap. This time it was clearer, desperate. It was not the solid knock of a neighbor or a traveler. It was the sound of something weak, something small, trying to get in. He set the harness aside and rose silently, his movements economical. He did not reach for a lamp. He reached for the Spencer rifle leaning against the wall. He moved to the door, the floorboard solid beneath his heavy boots, and pressed his eye to the small peephole he had drilled in the thick wood. He saw nothing but a vortex of white. The snow was a solid, moving wall. "Who's there?" His voice was a rasp, rough from disuse. A pause, and then a cry so thin it might have been a bird. "Please, it was a woman?" Elias frowned, his suspicion a cold knot in his gut. "A woman, here, in the heart of the Beartooth Mountains, miles from any known trail? It was a trick. It had to be. Bandits. Maybe using a woman as bait. Go away," he called out, his voice flat. "No shelter here. Please," the voice begged again, breaking. "I'm freezing. Just, please." He heard a thump, as if a body had slid down the door. The sound of it, the sheer hopelessness, cut through his caution. He could let her freeze. It was the smart thing to do. It would keep his world quiet. He cursed, a low, bitter sound. He thumbed the hammer of the rifle back, just in case, and slid the heavy iron bar from its brackets. Elias pulled the door inward. The wind blasted into the room, shoving him back a step. It brought the snow and the cold, and with it, a shape. It was a woman, or the ghost of one. She was huddled on his doorstep, half buried in the fresh drift. But it was not her thinness, nor the blue tint of her skin, that held him fast. She was wearing a wedding dress. The garment was a ruin. The fine white lace was ripped to shreds, caked with frozen mud and stained with something dark near the hem. The sleeves were torn away. She was barefoot, her feet raw and bloody. Ice clung to her hair, which had fallen in wet, dark ropes around her face. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark in a face pale as porcelain. She looked terrified, not just of the cold, but of him. "Please," she whispered, her lips cracked. "Just for one night, I won't be any trouble." Elias stood there, the rifle heavy in his hand, the wind stealing the heat from his home. He looked at her, then past her into the swirling blackness. There was no one else, no trap, just this one broken thing. He saw the way she shivered, a violent, uncontrollable tremor that shook her entire frame. He stared for a long moment, his face hard. He didn't want this. He wanted the silence. He wanted the storm to be the only thing he had to fight. But he was not the animal they had tried to make him. Not yet. He lowered the rifle, stepped aside, and jerked his head. In! She tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't hold her. She crawled, dragging the ruined dress over the threshold, pulling herself in on her hands and knees. The moment she was clear, Elias slammed the door against the storm and dropped the bar back in place. The sudden silence of the cabin was deafening. The woman lay on the rough floorboards, coughing, a dry racking sound. Then, as the meager warmth of the fire touched her skin, she collapsed entirely, her body going limp. She fell onto her side, curled like a child, and did not move. Elias watched her. He saw the sharp line of her ribs beneath the soaked satin, the dreadful stillness that had replaced the shivering. She wasn't just cold. She was dying. With a sigh that sounded more like a growl, he propped the rifle by the door and knelt beside her. "Ma'am?" No response. He touched her shoulder. She was colder than the leather of his saddle. He scooped her up. She weighed almost nothing. He carried her the few feet to the hearth and laid her on the bearskin rug, as close to the fire as he dared. For a moment, he was paralyzed. He was a man accustomed to tending wounds, bullet holes, knife cuts, broken legs on horses. This was different. This was a fragile cold. He had to get the wet things off her. He worked clumsily, his thick, scarred fingers struggling with the tiny pearl buttons on the back of the dress. They were frozen solid. He gave up, retrieved his skinning knife, and, with a few precise cuts, sliced the ruined bodice from her. He pulled the soaked, icy fabric away, leaving her in a thin, torn chemise that was just as wet. Her skin was mottled, a sickly blue-white. He went to his cot and pulled off the heavy wool blankets, wrapping her tightly, tucking the edges in until she was a tight cocoon. He propped her head on a rolled-up flour sack. Then he went to the stove, stoked the embers, and added water from his bucket to the pot of stew that was always simmering. It was mostly rabbit and root vegetables, thin but hot. He ladled some of the broth into a tin mug. He knelt by her again and lifted her head. "You need to drink this." Her eyes flickered open. They were gray, shot through with panic. When she saw him, so close, she flinched, trying to pull away. "Don't," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Don't touch me. You'll die if you don't get warm," he said, his voice flat, impatient. "It's broth. Just drink it." He held the mug to her lips. She stared at him, her gaze traveling from his scarred face to the knife on his belt. But the smell of the hot stew, the primal need for warmth, was stronger than her fear. She parted her lips. He tipped the mug slowly. She swallowed, coughed, then swallowed again. He gave her half the mug before her teeth started to chatter so violently she could barely drink. He set the mug down and pulled the blankets tighter, rubbing her arms and back through the wool, trying to force circulation back into her. His touch was rough, impersonal, the way he would gentle a spooked horse. She endured it, her eyes squeezed shut, silent tears freezing on her eyelashes. She said nothing. She didn't ask his name. She didn't say thank you. She just lay there, ashamed and terrified. A broken sparrow he had accidentally saved from the hawk. As the heat finally began to penetrate, the violent shivering subsided into a low tremor. Her breathing deepened, catching in her chest. She slipped from raw exhaustion into a troubled sleep, her mind tumbling backward, away from the warm cabin and back into the cold hell she had just escaped. Hours before, it was not a storm of snow, but of people. She had been standing in the muddy main street of Junction Creek, a raw mining town that smelled of pine sawdust and despair. The church bell was ringing, but not for a service. It was ringing for her. "Harlot," a woman's voice shrieked. It was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, her face twisted in a mask of righteousness. "She fled the altar," a man shouted. "She spat on the house of God," Clara had tried to explain. She had tried to tell them that the preacher's son, the man she was supposed to marry, had come to her room the night before, that he had been drunk, that he had torn her nightdress and put his hands on her, whispering filthy things, promising what he would do once the ring was on her finger. When she fought him, he had struck her, splitting her lip. She had run. She had hidden in the livery until morning, praying her father would believe her. But her father had stood beside the preacher. Her betrothed stood there too, his face a perfect mask of wronged piety, a small, satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "She is a liar," the preacher had boomed, his voice rolling over the gathered crowd. "She tried to tempt my son, and when he rebuffed her, she fled her sacred vows." "Whore!" another voice called. A rock struck her shoulder. It was small, but it stung. Then another, larger, glanced off her head. She cried out, backing away. They surged forward. Men, women, even children, their faces ugly with a shared, feverish anger. They had so little in this hard place, but they had their rules. She had broken them. She saw her own father turn his back. That was when the terror truly hit. No one would help her. She was utterly alone. She ran. She fled down the street, the heavy wedding dress, the one her mother had worn, dragging in the filth. They chased her, throwing stones and mud, their voices a single baying sound. She scrambled past the edge of town and plunged into the thick pines, just as the first heavy, wet flakes of the blizzard began to fall. She didn't look back. She just ran until her lungs burned and her feet were numb, until the town was gone. And there was nothing left but the trees and the rising wind. In the cabin, Elias sat in his chair, watching her. The fire had settled into a low, steady burn. The rifle was back across his lap. He studied the woman who had breached his fortress. He had pulled the blankets back from her face so she could breathe. And in the soft light, he could see she was young. Younger than he'd thought. Maybe 19 or 20. There was a dark, purpling bruise high on her cheekbone, and her bottom lip was split and swollen. A wedding dress, a beating, a blizzard. He was a man who preferred simple equations, but this one didn't add up. Runaway wives were common enough, but they usually ran with someone. They took a horse, money. They didn't run barefoot into a storm with nothing but a ruined dress and a look of pure terror. He was torn, part of him. The part that had built this cabin to be left alone, saw her as a threat. She was a complication, a piece of the messy, cruel world he had escaped. She would bring trouble. Women always brought trouble. But another part, something older and deeper, something he thought had died long ago, stirred. He saw the way her hand was curled near her face, as if protecting herself even in sleep. He saw the vulnerability. It wasn't a trick. It was the raw, scraped clean truth. He sat there for hours, guarding his fire, guarding his solitude, and guarding the woman who had shattered it. His mind torn between suspicion and a strange, aching softness that felt like a wound reopening. The gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the snow-caked window when she woke. It was not a gentle stirring. She woke with a choked gasp, her body jerking upright, her eyes flying open. She was trapped in the blankets, her arms pinned. "No!" she screamed, a raw, terrified sound that filled the small cabin. "Get off me! Don't!" Elias was on his feet in an instant, the rifle leveled, his heart hammering as he scanned the shadows. But there was nothing. The door was barred. The windows were sealed. The threat was inside her head. He saw her thrashing, fighting the blankets, her eyes wide and unseeing, still trapped in the nightmare. He lowered the gun and took a step toward her. "Ma'am, you're safe." She didn't hear him. She was breathing in short, panicked gasps. "Ma'am," he said again, pitching his voice lower, softer, the way he used to speak to a horse that had seen a snake. "Easy now. You're in a cabin. You're safe. It's just the storm." His voice, calm and deep, finally cut through the panic. Her eyes focused on him. She stared, her chest heaving. She saw the cabin, the low light, the fire, and him, the man with the scarred face, The fight drained out of her, replaced by a wave of shame. She pulled the blankets tighter, covering herself, and huddled into a ball, turning her face away from him. Elias let out a long breath and ran a hand through his hair. He walked to the stove and tossed a few more logs into the firebox, the sound of the metal door clanging shut making her flinch. He made coffee, boiling the grounds in a pot over the fire. The familiar, bitter smell a small comfort. He didn't speak to her. He gave her space. After a long while, she finally moved. She unwrapped herself and sat up, keeping the heavy blankets draped around her shoulders. Her ruined dress was a stiff, frozen heap by the door. She looked at him, then at the door, then back at him. "I must go," she said. Her voice was a cracked whisper. Elias didn't turn from the fire. He poured coffee into his mug. "Snow's 5 feet deep." I cannot burden you," she insisted, her voice shaking. "You gave me shelter. God bless you for it, but I must leave." She tried to stand, but her feet, now raw and blistered, refused to take her weight. She hissed in pain and fell back to the rug. Elias turned, the tin mug steaming in his hand. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You want to leave?" He walked to the door. He lifted the heavy bar, his muscles flexing under his wool shirt. He pulled the door open. A solid wall of white light and wind filled the frame. The snow was not in drifts. It was a solid sheet, packed hard by the gale, reaching higher than his waist. The wind ripped into the room, sending ashes from the hearth swirling. "Go on," he said, his voice flat. "You'll be dead before you take 10 steps, frozen solid in minutes." Clara stared at the white expanse. It was not a world. It was a tomb. There was no trail, no trees, just an endless, churning white. The fight, the last small ember of her desperate flight, finally died. She let her head fall forward, and a dry sob escaped her. She was trapped. Elias shut the door, the sound final. He dropped the bar back into place. He walked back to the fire and stood there, drinking his coffee, his back to her. "It'll snow for another day, maybe 2. You'll stay." It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. The second day passed in a strained, heavy silence. He offered her more broth, which she accepted. He found an old, clean wool shirt and a pair of trousers he'd long since worn out, leaving them on the stool for her. She changed while his back was turned, bundling the blankets around her waist to keep the trousers from falling off. They existed in the small space, moving around each other carefully. He mended his harness. She sat by the fire, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. The silence grew, becoming heavier than the snow piling up outside. It had to be broken. He spoke first, his voice rough. "My name is Elias." She looked up, startled. She had been staring into the flames, her mind 1,000 miles away. "What?" "Elias." He pointed at his own chest. "My name." She swallowed, her throat dry. It felt strange to speak, to anchor herself to this place. "Clara," she whispered. "Clara," he repeated. The name sounded strange in the cabin. They fell silent again. But something had shifted. They were no longer just a man and a refugee. They were Elias and Clara. Later, as the light began to fade, Clara's restless gaze drifted around the room. She was looking for anything to distract her from her own thoughts. Her eyes settled on a small, rough-hewn shelf near his cot. On it sat a few items: a small, dog-eared Bible, a stack of tintype photographs, faded and dark, and hanging from a wooden peg, a silver locket, tarnished with age. She pointed, her voice hesitant. "Is that your family?" Elias, who had been cleaning his rifle, went utterly still. His hand stopped moving. He did not look at her. He stared at the wall, but his eyes were seeing something else entirely. The warmth that had slowly returned to the cabin seemed to vanish, sucked out by a sudden, intense cold that came from him. "Don't," he said. The word was not angry. It was flat, dead. It was the sound of a door being slammed shut and locked from the inside. Clara flinched as if he had struck her. "I'm sorry," she whispered, pulling her hand back. I didn't mean to pry." He said nothing. He simply returned to his work, the rhythmic snick-snick of the oiled rag on the rifle barrel the only sound in the room. Clara turned back to the fire, wrapping her arms around herself. She had survived the town. She had survived the storm. She was not sure she could survive this crushing, wounded silence. Night fell. The second night. Elias lit a second lantern, casting strange, dancing shadows on the log walls. He cooked again, dividing the last of the rabbit stew onto 2 tin plates. He handed one to her. She took it, careful not to let their fingers brush. "Thank you." They ate. The scrape of spoons against tin was loud in the small space. Clara forced herself to eat, though the food tasted like ash. She kept glancing at him. He ate methodically, his gaze fixed on the floor. The tension was different now. Yesterday, she had been terrified of him, the strange, silent man who had taken her in. Now, she understood. He was not a threat. He was a wound. He was a man who had walled himself up just as completely as the blizzard had walled them in. She was scared, but the fear was for the world outside, for the men who had chased her, for the father who had abandoned her. She was not, she realized, afraid of Elias. Elias watched her from under his brow. He saw the way she flinched when the wind hit the cabin hard. He saw the way she held the plate, as if expecting him to snatch it back. She was like a deer, poised to bolt, but with nowhere to run. He had wanted to be left alone, to nurse his own ghosts in peace. But this woman, this Clara, she had brought her own ghosts with her, and he found himself drawn to the raw, visible edges of her pain. It was a vulnerability that he recognized. It was a mirror of his own, buried so deep he'd almost forgotten it was there. He took her empty plate. "Get some sleep," he said, gesturing to the bearskin rug. "I'll take the chair." She nodded, not meeting his eyes, and curled up by the hearth, pulling the heavy blankets over her. Elias sat in his chair, the rifle resting against his knee, and prepared to wait out the storm. The snow did not stop. It fell for another day, and then another, a thick, smothering blanket that buried the world in white silence. The wind died, leaving a quiet so profound it felt heavy, as if the sky were pressing down on the small cabin. Time blurred, marked only by the weak gray light of day and the deep, firelit dark of night. The cabin, once Elias's solitary fortress, became a shared space, impossibly small. They had to move. They had to survive. Clara, driven by a need to prove she was not just a burden, insisted on helping. Her body was still weak, her muscles aching from the cold and the flight, but the shame of inaction was worse. "I can pull my own weight," she said on the third morning, her voice stronger. Elias had looked at her, his gaze skeptical. He needed to clear a path to the woodpile and break the ice on the stream. He nodded once, curtly. He gave her his spare coat, a heavy canvas thing worn smooth with use, its sheepskin lining smelling of wood smoke and him. He found a pair of his old boots, and she stuffed the toes with spare rags to make them fit. He had already dug a narrow trench toward the trees, the snow piled high on either side. She followed him, her steps clumsy, the cold air a sharp pain in her lungs. She helped him haul water, the two of them carrying the heavy bucket between them, their gloved hands brushing on the rope handle. She helped him prepare their meager meals, salt pork, beans, and gritty coffee. The simple physical tasks grounded her. Each scoop of snow, each slice of salt pork, was an act of defiance against the memory of Junction Creek. With every day, a little more strength returned. The hunted look in her eyes began to fade, replaced by a quiet, watchful resilience. Elias watched her. He was a man accustomed to being alone, and her presence was an intrusion he hadn't known how to name. It was distracting. He had lived for 2 years in a silence broken only by the wind and his own dark thoughts. Now, there was the rustle of her moving, the soft scrape of a spoon against a plate, the almost inaudible sound of her breathing as she slept by the fire. He found himself observing her in secret moments, when she thought he was mending a trap or oiling his rifle. He watched her one afternoon as she stood by the single, small window, which he kept scraped free of frost. She was gazing out at the endless white, her arms wrapped around her middle. She was humming, a low, absent sound. It was a simple tune, one he didn't recognize, fragile and thin in the heavy air of the cabin. The sound caught him off guard. It was the first truly human, unguarded sound he had heard in years. It was a sound of life. He must have made a noise, because she stopped abruptly, her shoulders tensing. She turned, a flush rising in her pale cheeks, her eyes wide, as if he had caught her in a transgression. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "No need," Elias said, his voice rougher than he intended. He turned his attention back to the harness strap in his hands, but the little tune echoed in his mind. Her presence was altering the shape of his solitude. It was smoothing the raw edges of his isolation. Whether he wanted it to or not, the confession came on the 5th night. The storm had paused, and the world outside was locked in a cold, moonlit stillness. The fire crackled. Elias sat on his stool, sharpening his skinning knife. Clara was sitting on the bearskin rug, mending the trousers he had lent her, her stitches small and neat. "His name was Gideon," she said, her voice so low it was almost lost in the hiss of the fire. Elias's hand stilled on the whetstone. He did not look up. He waited. "He was Preacher Hollis's son," she continued, her voice trembling, but she forced it steady. My PA arranged the marriage. He said it was a good match, that the preacher was a powerful man in the territory, and that I should be grateful." She stared into the flames, her mind replaying the street in Junction Creek. "Gideon, he was pious in the daylight. He quoted scripture, but at night he drank. He liked to say what he was owed, what a wife was for." Elias stopped his work entirely, his knuckles white on the handle of the knife. He knew this kind of man. The wilderness was full of them, men who used God as a shield for their own rot. "The night before the wedding," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He came to my room. My PA was at the saloon, celebrating my good fortune. Gideon was drunk. He said he wanted an advance on his property." A single tear traced a path down her cheek. She did not wipe it away. "He tore my nightdress. When I told him to leave, he struck me." She touched the healing split on her lip. I fought him. I hit him with the porcelain water pitcher. I ran. I hid in the livery until morning. I truly thought my PA would believe me, that he would protect me." Her voice was thick with a shame that did not belong to her. "But Gideon, he told them I tried to tempt him, that I was impure. And when he rebuffed me, I attacked him like a madwoman and fled my sacred vows. They all believed him," she said, the words choked. "The whole town, they gathered in the street. They called me a liar, a whore, her own family, my PA. He turned his back on me. He just stood there and turned his back." The story hung in the air, raw and ugly. Clara hunched her shoulders, as if expecting a blow. She had expected disgust, or pity, or worse, the same disbelief she'd seen in her father's eyes. Elias was silent for a long time. The only sound was the pop of a resin pocket in the fire. He set the knife and whetstone down. He stood, walked to the stove, and poured a tin cup of coffee, the bitter smell filling the cabin. He turned and looked at her. His face was grim, the scar a white line in the firelight. But his eyes held no judgment. They were not cold. They were steady. They were the eyes of a man who had seen the world for what it was and was not surprised by its cruelty. "He's the liar," Elias said, his voice a low rasp. That was all. 3 words. Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. It felt as if a heavy, iron band around her chest had just broken. He believed her. He did not question. He did not doubt. His simple, absolute acceptance was a greater comfort than 100 sympathetic words could ever have been. A new understanding settled between them. The next day, the silence was no longer strained. It was shared. That evening, as she helped him clear their meager dinner, she passed him a tin cup of water. Her fingers, chapped from the cold, brushed the back of his hand. It was the hand with the old, puckered scar, a burn mark that traveled from his knuckles to his wrist. His skin was rough, calloused from work and weapons. Hers, by comparison, felt soft, despite the chores. The touch was accidental, but neither of them pulled away immediately. It lasted only a second, maybe two, but it was a jolt. It was the first, simple human contact she had experienced in so long that was not violent. It was just warmth. Clara's breath hitched. Elias's gaze snapped to hers, his dark eyes suddenly intense, alert. He pulled his hand back, his grip tightening on the cup. Clara quickly folded her arms, hiding her own hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. The air, which had been comfortable, was now charged, thick with an unspoken question. Elias cleared his throat and turned away, staring into the fire. He had taken her confession. He felt, in a way he couldn't quite name, that he owed her a piece of his own. "The war," he said, his voice quiet. He held up his scarred hand. "A powder burn, from a raid in Missouri." Clara waited, sensing this was only the beginning. "I was a scout," he said, his voice distant, as if speaking of another man. "For the Union. It wasn't clean work. Not like soldiers in a line. It was tracking, hiding, knowing where the enemy would be before he did." He fell silent, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. Clara watched the side of his face, the hard line of his jaw. "When it was over, I thought I was done with it," he continued, his voice lower. "I came west, thought I could start over. I wasn't alone. I had a fiancée, Annabelle." He glanced toward the small, rough shelf by his cot, the one she had looked at before. His gaze rested on the tarnished silver locket. "We were building a place, near the Sweetwater. It was good land." He looked back at the fire. "It was a Sioux raid. They weren't looking for us. They were after cattle from a neighboring ranch. We were just in the way." His voice went flat, all life draining out of it, leaving only the hard, dry facts. "I was checking a fence line, maybe half a mile away. I heard the shots. I ran, but I was too late." He closed his eyes for a brief second. "The cabin was on fire. They took her. She must have fought. I found her by the creek." He opened his eyes, but he wasn't seeing the fire. He was seeing that creek. "I was a scout. My whole life was about seeing what was coming, and I didn't see it. I was supposed to keep her safe. I couldn't save her." He picked up the rifle from beside his chair and began to check its action. His movements automatic, mechanical. "So I came here, built this place. Somewhere no one would look. Somewhere there was nothing left to lose." Clara finally understood the deep, crushing silence of this man. He was a mirror of her. She was an outcast, shamed by her town. He was an exile, shamed by his own ghosts. She did not offer him pity. She knew, instinctively, that pity was an insult. He did not want comfort. He wanted, perhaps, what she had wanted, to be believed. "You couldn't save her," Clara said, her voice soft but firm. "So you buried yourself. I couldn't fight them. So I ran." Elias stopped his movements. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength beneath the fear, the resilience that had carried her barefoot through a blizzard. "We both did what we had to do to survive," he said. That night, the cabin was filled with the ghosts they had both invited in. Sleep was impossible. Clara rose from her blankets by the hearth. The fire was low, the cabin cast in shadows. She felt a desperate need for air, for space. She walked to the heavy door and lifted the small wooden slide that covered the peephole. She gasped. The storm had broken. The world outside was not black, but a brilliant, impossible blue-white. A full moon, huge and silver, hung in a sky of black crystal. The snow was a vast, glittering ocean, the drifts sculpted by the wind into waves. The pines were draped in white, their shadows long and sharp as knives. It was the most beautiful, and the most desolate, thing she had ever seen. She heard the floorboards creak behind her. Elias had risen from his chair. He came to stand beside her, his tall frame blocking what little light came from the fire. They stood together, shoulders almost touching, looking out at the vast, frozen, silent world. The moonlight streamed through the small opening, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She was intensely aware of him. The heat radiating from his body, the size of him, the faint smell of wood smoke and coffee. His shoulder brushed hers. It was the lightest touch, a whisper of wool against wool. Her breath caught in her throat. She turned her head to look up at him, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm. He was still staring out at the snow, his profile carved from stone in the moonlight. "I'm not scared here," she whispered. The words were out before she could stop them, and she realized, with a jolt, that they were true. She was trapped in a wilderness with a strange, scarred man, but the terror that had lived in her belly since Junction Creek was gone. Elias was silent for a long moment. She could feel the tension in him, the stillness of a man holding himself in check. Then, slowly, as if his arm were impossibly heavy, he turned his head. His gaze met hers in the dim light. He lifted his hand. She thought he might touch her face, or her hair. She flinched, just slightly. He didn't. Instead, he placed his hand gently on her back, his large, warm palm resting flat between her shoulder blades. It was not a romantic touch. It was not a possessive touch. It was a touch of grounding. It was solid. It said, "I am here. You are safe." He said nothing. He just kept his hand there, and they stood together, sharing the same small square of moonlight, breathing in the cold, clean air. The peace was a fragile thing. It lasted one day. The next afternoon, the sky turned a dark, bruised gray. The wind picked up, not a howl this time, but a low, steady moan that rattled the window. And the snow began again, this time harder, drier, driven by a wind that came straight from the north. This was a new, more vicious storm. The temperature plummeted. The small cabin, which had felt like a sanctuary, began to feel like a trap. Elias worked constantly, feeding the stove, but the cold pressed in, seeping through the chinking in the logs. The corners of the room were frigid. Night fell. It was a cold unlike anything Clara had ever known. It felt personal, malicious. Elias watched her as she huddled by the hearth, wrapped in every blanket she had. Her teeth were chattering, her lips tinged with blue. The floor, even this close to the fire, was catching a bitter draft. He looked at his cot. It was narrow, built for one man, but it was raised off the floor, and he had his thickest furs on it. "You'll freeze to death there," he said, his voice blunt. Clara looked up, her eyes wide. I'm fine." "No, you're not," he said. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "The floor will be ice by morning. You'll be dead." He saw the fear that flashed in her face, and his voice softened. "Just slightly. We have to share the cot, for warmth. It's the only way we'll both see sunrise." Clara's blood ran colder than the storm. The cot, his cot, the thought of lying so close to him, to any man, brought back the image of Gideon, his wet mouth, his bruising grip. "I can't," she stammered, shaking her head, pulling the blankets tighter. I'll stay by the fire. I promise. I'll be fine." "Clara, don't be a fool," Elias said, his voice sharp now. "This ain't a town. This is Montana. The cold doesn't care about your feelings. It just kills." He saw her panic, the way she shrank from him. He let out a long breath. "I'm not him. I'm not the preacher's son. I'm just trying to keep you alive." He waited. She looked at his face, searching for any sign of deception, any hint of the predator. She saw only a tired, grim frustration. And she knew he was right. The cold was a living thing, and it was wrapping its fingers around her. Slowly, her limbs stiff, she stood. She kept one blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. A pathetic shield. Elias blew out the lantern, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the low, orange glow of the stove's vent. He lay down on the cot first, on the side against the log wall, his back to her. He was fully dressed. "Get in," he said, his voice muffled. She hesitated. her heart a wild bird in her chest. Then, taking a shuddering breath, she lay down on the outside edge, her back to him. She kept herself rigid, as far on the edge as she could without falling to the floor. The cot was perilously small. Her back was pressed firmly against his. She went rigid. She could feel the solid, unyielding wall of his back. The muscles tensed beneath his wool shirt. The heat coming off him was intense, a living furnace. She wanted to leap up, to run, but Elias did not move. He lay as still as a man carved from wood. He didn't turn, he didn't speak, he just breathed. The minutes ticked by. An hour. The wind moaned outside, slowly, agonizingly. The rigid terror in her muscles began to ease. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but the primal, desperate need for warmth was stronger. His heat was seeping into her, soaking through the blanket, pushing back the deadly chill that had settled in her bones. This was not desire. It was not comfort. It was survival. They lay there in the dark, back to back, not touching in any way except for the long line of their spines. They did not sleep. They were both too aware, too tense, in the frozen silence of the cabin, surrounded by the screaming wind. Their breathing, hesitant at first, began to find a shared rhythm. A slow inhale, a long, shuddering exhale. Two strangers, two outcasts, clinging to life, together. The second storm passed, leaving the world even deeper in white. The sun, when it returned, was a pale, cold disk that did little to warm the air, but it was light. The light, after so many days of gray gloom, felt like a small, hesitant promise. They were no longer trapped by the weather, but by the sheer volume of it. The snow was a physical barrier, a wall between their small, isolated world and the one that had cast them both out. The days fell into a new rhythm, one defined not by fear and survival, but by shared existence. A routine was born, and in that routine, an intimacy they had not sought began to grow. They had to work together. The woodpile, which Elias had kept stocked, was running low. They spent a morning digging it out, a narrow, shoulder-width trench cut through the chest-high drifts. He used the broad shovel, she the smaller stew-pot, to clear the packed snow. Then came the wood-cutting. Elias had a small clearing where he felled pines. He taught her to use the two-man saw. They stood on opposite sides of a downed log, pulling the serrated blade back and forth. "Let the saw do the work," he'd said, his voice a low rumble in the frozen air. "Just pull, don't push." She fell into the rhythm, her movements matching his. Pull, slide, pull, slide. Her arms, weak at first, began to ache, then hardened. She felt the muscles in her back protesting, but she bit her lip and pulled, determined not to be a burden, determined to earn the heat they both needed. They worked in silence, the shing-shing-shing of the saw the only sound, their breath pluming in the air. When a log finally split, the sharp crack was satisfying. A small victory. He taught her how to swing the axe to split the rounds, his large hands guiding hers on the smooth hickory handle, showing her how to aim for the small cracks in the wood. "Stand with your feet apart," he instructed, his voice close to her ear, "and let the weight of the head fall. Don't fight it." His closeness was practical, instructional, but she was intensely aware of him. The solidness of his chest behind her back, the calloused warmth of his hand covering hers. She swung, and the blade bit deep, the wood splitting with a clean thwack. A small smile touched her lips. He stepped back, his gaze lingering on her for a moment. "You learn fast." They hauled the wood back to the cabin, their arms full, their boots crunching in the narrow path. They stacked it by the stove, a fortress of fuel that promised another night of warmth. In the long evenings, by the light of the fire and the single lantern, they began to talk, not of their deep, breaking wounds. Those had been confessed. The abscesses lanced, and now needed quiet to heal. Instead, they shared the small things, the soft stories that make up a life. She told him about growing up in Ohio, on a small farm that smelled of damp earth and apples. She told him about her mother, who had died when she was 10, and who had taught her to hum the tune he had heard, a song about a riverboat. He spoke of his own childhood in Illinois, of learning to track rabbits with his father, of a dog named Buster that had followed him everywhere. The stories were simple, fragments of a life before the war, before Annabelle, before the silence. One night, he was describing a horse he had once broken, a stubborn blue roan that nothing could tame. He'd throw any man who put a saddle on him, Elias said, a faint smile touching the corners of his mouth, softening the scar on his face. But he'd follow a man with a sugar cube in his pocket clear across the county. Clara laughed. It was not a giggle, but a low, soft sound, rusty from disuse. The sound startled them both. Elias stopped speaking, his eyes fixed on her. The smile on his face faded, replaced by something deeper, quieter. The laughter died in her throat, and she looked down. Suddenly shy, he began to call her Clara. It was a subtle shift. He no longer said ma'am, and he didn't just speak the name when he needed her attention. He would say, "The fire needs wood. Clara." Or, "That coffee smells good. Clara." He said it with care, as if the name itself was something he was learning to hold gently. The sound of it in his low voice made her feel real, not like the harlot of Junction Creek or the runaway bride of her nightmares. Just Clara. She wore his clothes as if they were her own. The heavy wool trousers were held up by a length of rope he'd given her, and the sleeves of his flannel shirt were rolled up to her elbows. The clothes were too big, but they were warm, and they were clean. The wedding dress, that ruined symbol of her shame, was a different matter. One afternoon, while Elias was outside checking his traps, Clara had taken it from the floor where it had dried into a stiff, muddy relic. She couldn't bring herself to burn it. It had been her mother's, but she could not bear to look at it. She had folded it, the torn lace and stained satin hidden within itself, and tucked it into the bottom of her borrowed flour sack pillow, a ghost put to rest. When Elias returned, he glanced at the spot where the dress had been, then at her, but said nothing. He knew. The change between them was palpable. The cabin was no longer a refuge with two strangers. It was a home with two people. The small space forced a physical intimacy they learned to navigate. They brushed past each other at the stove, their shoulders touching. He would hand her a tin plate, his fingers grazing hers. Each touch, once a source of tension or accident, now became a quiet, simple fact. One morning, the light was clear and bright, the sun reflecting off the snow with a blinding intensity. Clara was at the small table, her back to Elias, trying to knead a small, sad lump of dough made from flour and water. She was trying to make flatbread, something to eat besides the endless salt pork. She was concentrating, her brow furrowed, flour dusting her cheek. She felt his gaze on her, a sudden, intense weight on her back. It was different from the secret glances he used to take. This was a steady, focused look. She stopped her kneading, her hands still in the dough. She turned her head, slowly. Elias was sitting on his stool by the fire, a mended trap in his lap. Forgotten. He was watching her. His eyes were not guarded, not empty. They were filled with a raw, unmistakable longing. It was a look that went past the wool shirt, past the bruises, past the fear. It was a look that saw her, the woman, Clara. It was the look of a man starving, who had just been shown a feast. Her first instinct was to turn away, to hide. It was too much, too exposed. But she didn't. She held his gaze. She saw the longing, and she saw the pain behind it, the fear of reaching for something that could be taken away. In that shared look, a silent understanding passed between them. She did not fear his want, and he saw that she did not fear it. The day passed in a new kind of tension. It was not fear, it was anticipation. A taut string had been plucked, and it was now vibrating in the small space between them. That night, after their meal of salt pork and the slightly burned flatbread, the silence crackled. Clara got up to put the plates by the wash bucket. She walked to the hearth, ostensibly to warm her hands, but her heart was hammering. Elias rose from his stool. He moved to stand beside her, so close she could feel the heat of his body. They both stared into the flames, the firelight dancing on their faces. "Clara," he said, his voice a low rasp. She turned to him. He was so tall. She had to tilt her head back to look at him. His face was in shadow, his eyes dark and unreadable. He lifted his hand, the one with the powder burn. He hesitated, his fingers trembling slightly. Then, slowly, he touched her face. His calloused thumb traced the line of her cheekbone, where the bruise had finally faded to a pale yellow. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch. A small, involuntary movement. A shuddering breath escaped her. That was all he needed. He cupped her face in his hands, his grip gentle but firm. He lowered his head. The kiss was hesitant, a question. His lips were chapped, tasting of coffee and wood smoke. It was slow, careful, as if he were afraid of breaking her. Clara's hands came up to rest on his chest, her fingers clutching his shirt. She kissed him back, a mirror of his own hesitation. But beneath the caution was a desperate, unspoken desire, a need to be touched, to be held, to be wanted not as property, but as a person. The kiss deepened, just slightly. It was not a kiss of passion, not yet. It was a kiss of profound, aching loneliness. It was the first bridge across the silence. He pulled back, his forehead resting against hers. They were both breathing hard. Clara kept her eyes closed, afraid of what she would see, afraid of what she had done. She had invited this. She had wanted this. And now, the fear that followed desire rushed in. The memory of Gideon, his wet, demanding mouth. "Elias," she whispered, her voice shaking. She pulled back enough to look at him, her hand still gripping his shirt. She had to know. She had to be sure. "Do you want me?" The question hung in the air. She was not just asking about his body. She was asking about his heart. She was asking if she was just a convenience, a warm body to pass the long, cold nights. Elias looked down at her, his dark eyes serious. All traces of the distant, wounded man gone. He was present. He was here. He put his hands on her shoulders, his grip solid and grounding. "Clara," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. "I want you, not just for one night." He was giving her back her own words. She had come to his door pleading for one night of shelter. He was offering her something else entirely. The fear in her broke, replaced by a wave of something else, a fierce, trembling wave of hope. He didn't kiss her again. He waited. He was giving her the choice, the one thing she had never been given. She gave it. She leaned forward, rising on her toes, and kissed him. This time, it was different. It was her choice. The kiss was deeper, surer. He responded, his arms wrapping around her, pulling her close against his solid frame. He held her as if she were the only anchor in a storm. He lifted her easily into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. She buried her face in his neck, her entire body shaking. He carried her the few steps to the cot, the one they had shared for warmth, and laid her down on the furs. He did not rush. He moved slowly, deliberately, his eyes never leaving hers. He lay down beside her, propped on one elbow, and just looked at him. He traced the line of her jaw with one finger. "You're safe here," he whispered. He was unlearning a lifetime of grief. She was unlearning a lifetime of fear. He made love to her with a tenderness that bordered on reverence. Every touch was a question, and he waited for her silent answer. He was slow, gentle, his movements careful as he kissed her throat, her shoulders. He was rediscovering a language he thought he had forgotten. For Clara, it was a revelation. This was not the bruising, selfish act she had been taught to fear. This was not a taking. It was a sharing. It was warmth. It was kindness. When he finally entered her, her breath hitched, but there was no pain. There was only the profound, shocking intimacy of being truly seen, truly held. After, as they lay tangled in the furs, the fire burning low, it was too much. The kindness, the tenderness, the safety. It broke the last wall she had built around herself. A sob tore from her throat, a raw, ragged sound. She twisted away, trying to hide her face, ashamed of her own brokenness. "I'm sorry, Elias didn't let her go. He pulled her back, rolling her against his chest, his arms a strong cage around her. He held her tight as the sobs shook her body, the tears soaking his shirt. He just held her, his hand stroking her hair. "You're not broken," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick. "You're not broken." He said it again and again, a quiet, steady litany against the sound of her weeping. He held her until the last shudder subsided, and she lay limp in his arms, exhausted but clean. They lay in the quiet for a long time. The cabin was warm, safe. In this small room, the world was held at bay. Clara, her voice muffled against his chest, spoke first. "Annabelle, your fiancé." Elias tensed, just slightly. "You still love her," Clara stated. It was not an accusation. It was a fact. Elias let out a long breath. She's a part of me, a part that died. I didn't think anything could grow there again." He shifted, reaching over the side of the cot. His hand fumbled on the small, rough shelf. He brought back the silver locket. He opened it. In the dim glow from the stove, she could see the faded tintype. A young woman, smiling, her hair piled high. She was pretty. She liked wildflowers, Elias said, his voice soft, distant. Indian paintbrush. She said they looked like the fire was coming right up out of the ground. Clara reached out and touched the cool silver. She looked at the smiling face. She felt no jealousy, no anger, only a deep, aching sadness for the man who held her. She was not in competition with a ghost. She was sitting with a man who was finally, painfully, coming back to life. "She was beautiful," Clara whispered. Elias closed the locket, the small click sounding loud in the silence. He didn't put it back on the shelf. He set it on the floor beside the cot. He was setting it down. He turned back to Clara, pulling the furs up over her bare shoulders. He looked at her, his eyes clear. "You want to stay?" She said it quietly, her voice still hoarse from crying. It was not a question. It was a statement, a plea. "If you'll have me." Elias said nothing. He had no words for what he was feeling. The silence, his old, familiar friend, had failed him. So he acted. He pulled her closer, his arms tightening around her. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. He held her with a desperate strength, as if he could weld her to him, as if the world could never pull them apart. It was all the answer she needed. Miles away, in the raw, muddy town of Absaroka, the air in the Golden Nugget saloon was thick with smoke and the smell of stale whiskey. A tall, thin man in a worn duster, his face pocked and his eyes the color of ice, nailed a piece of paper to the rough-hewn wall. It was a bounty poster. A few drunken prospectors glanced at it, then turned back to their cards. But one man, a freighter named Silas, leaned in, squinting at the print. He read the words aloud, his voice slurring. "Wanted, Clara Fairchild, runaway bride, fled her sacred vows at Junction Creek," he whistled, a low, impressed sound. $200, alive. That's a powerful sum for a runaway wife." The man in the duster, Hess, turned, his cold eyes landing on the freighter. "You know the name?" Silas nodded, feeling important. "I know it. I was in Junction Creek 2, maybe 3 weeks back. Saw the whole thing. The preacher's son looked like he'd been hit with a skillet. The girl, she ran, just bolted into the pines as the storm was rolling in. Plumb foolish. Most figure she's dead, frozen in a drift." Hess smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. $200 says she's not. The preacher wants her back, wants to make an example. You'll never find her." Silas spat. "That's Beartooth country. It'll swallow you whole." "I've got a good nose," Hess said, tapping his own. "And for $200, I can afford to hire a few more. We'll find her." He looked around the saloon. Who needs work? A few men, their faces hard and their pockets empty, pushed back their chairs and stood up. The posse was forming. The peace, once it had settled, was as thick and profound as the snow. The days following their first true night together had a new shape. The cabin was no longer a refuge. It was a home. They moved with the easy, unspoken rhythm of a couple long married, their tasks interwoven. He would rise first in the dark, his movements quiet, and build up the fire. She would follow, her form, wrapped in his shirt, silhouetted against the flames as she prepared the coffee. They were, for a short, blessed time, just Elias and Clara. But Elias was a scout. His instincts had been honed by years of war and survival. Peace was a luxury, and he had learned to distrust it. Clara sensed the shift before she understood it. It began subtly. Elias started taking walks. He said he was checking his trap lines, but he carried his Spencer rifle, not his trapping gear. He would be gone for hours, and when he returned, he was quiet. It was not the wounded, grieving quiet she had come to know. It was a new silence, sharp and cold, the silence of a man listening to something she could not hear. He began standing by the door, his head tilted, his gaze fixed on the distant tree line. He no longer sat by the fire, mending harness. He sat at the table, methodically, almost obsessively, polishing his rifle. He would break it down, oiling each piece, checking the action, the sights. Then he would reassemble it, his movements fluid and economical. "Elias?" she asked one evening, her voice soft as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "What is it? You're frightening me." He flinched, his body tensing at her touch before he consciously relaxed. "It's nothing," he said, his voice flat. "Just the weather. A thaw is coming. It makes the animals restless." She knew he was lying. The air was still, frozen solid. The restlessness was not in the animals. It was in him. The new, fragile trust between them suddenly felt thin, a layer of ice over a deep, cold current. He left the next morning, just after dawn. He told her he needed to hunt, that their supplies were running low. He took the rifle. He also, she noticed, slid his Bowie knife into his boot and tucked his revolver into the waistband of his trousers. He was gone for hours. The cabin, once her sanctuary, felt empty and cold. She tried to busy herself, to make the flatbread he had come to like, but a low, thrumming anxiety had settled in her chest. She went to tidy his cot, a small, domestic act to reclaim the peace. His saddlebags were on the floor beside it. He was usually so careful with his gear. She bent to pick them up, to place them on the table, when a piece of coarse paper, folded poorly, fell from an unbuckled flap. She picked it up. It was damp from the snow, the ink blurring in places. She unfolded it. The letters were thick, black, and brutal. "Wanted." Her heart stopped. She saw her name, Clara Fairchild. She read the words, her blood turning to ice. Runaway bride, fled her sacred vows, deceived the house of God, and then, at the bottom, $200, alive, to be returned to Junction Creek for judgment. She sank to the floor, the poster clutched in her hand. The cabin, her safe, warm world, dissolved. There was no sanctuary. There was only the running. She saw, in a sickening flash, what she had done. She had not found a home. She had built a trap, and she had pulled Elias in with her. She heard the crunch of his boots in the snow outside. He was back. Panic, raw and absolute, seized her. She couldn't think. She could only act. She scrambled to her feet, stumbling, her only thought to get away, to lead the trouble away from him. The door burst open. Elias stood there, a brace of rabbits in one hand. He saw her, her white face, the poster in her trembling hand. His face hardened. "Clara, they'll kill you," she whispered, her voice a strangled gasp. "Because of me, they'll kill you." She lunged past him. She grabbed the canvas coat, the one that smelled of him, and shoved her bare feet into his old, frozen boots. She didn't feel the cold. "Let me go," she screamed, shoving him, her small fists beating against his chest. "I won't let you die for me. I'll only bring you trouble." She broke free and ran. She plunged into the narrow snow trench they had dug together, her movements clumsy, her lungs burning. She would run, just as she had run from Junction Creek. She would run until the cold took her. It was better than seeing him die. She didn't get 10 yards. Elias caught her, his speed shocking. He grabbed her from behind, his arms wrapping around her waist, lifting her off her feet. He half tackled, half fell with her into a high drift, his body cushioning her from the packed ice below. She fought him, twisting and kicking, animalistic in her terror. "No, let me go. It's me they want. Let me go." "Stop it," he roared, his voice a raw command that cut through her panic. He pinned her wrists, his weight holding her down in the snow. "Stop fighting me, Clara!" He held her there, his face inches from hers, his breath coming in ragged clouds. His eyes were not angry. They were blazing. "Do you think I care about them?" he snarled, his grip on her wrists bruising. "Do you think I'm afraid of a two-bit bounty hunter? They'll kill you," she sobbed, the fight draining out of her, replaced by a devastating, cold despair. "They'll kill you, and it will be my fault." "Then let them try," he said, his voice dropping, fierce and low. He held her face, his gloved hands framing her jaw. "I'd rather fight 10 men. Clara, I'd rather fight 100. I'd rather this whole damn mountain came down on me than spend one more day in that empty, quiet cabin without you. Do you understand me? I am not losing you." He had been a ghost for 2 years. He had buried his life with Annabelle, but this fear, this raw, protective rage, it was the first thing that had made him feel truly alive. He couldn't save Annabelle. He would not fail to save Clara. He stared at her, his dark eyes burning into hers, daring her to argue. She stopped struggling. Her body went limp beneath his. She saw the truth in his face. He was not just offering her shelter. He was offering her his life, the sheer, terrible weight of his choice, of his love, crushed the last of her panic. He pulled her up, his movements rough. He lifted her into his arms as he had that first night. But this was no gentle rescue. He carried her back to the cabin and kicked the door shut with his boot. The sound echoed with finality. He set her down. The air in the cabin was electric, charged with adrenaline and a terrible, shared purpose. The time for softness was over. "We prepare," he said. It was not a suggestion. It was an order. "They'll follow my tracks from town. The thaw will make the trail easy. We have 1 day, maybe 2. Clara, her body still shaking, her mind still reeling, nodded. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard stone in her stomach, but it was now overlaid with his resolve. She was no longer a victim fleeing. She was a soldier. "What do I do?" "Help me," he said. For the rest of the day, they worked. They were a single unit, their movements economical, their words few. He pulled the heavy, rough-hewn planks from under his cot, the ones he'd never used for shelves. He handed her the hammer and the nails. "Board the window," he said. "Leave a slit, here." He drew a line with his knife, high enough to see, low enough to shoot from. She did it. Her hands were shaking, but her aim was true. The sound of the hammer striking the nails was a brutal, rhythmic punctuation to their fear. With each nail, the light in the cabin dimmed, until only a single, thin bar of gray day remained. While she worked, Elias was barricading the door. He didn't just bar it, he began wedging the heavy table against it, reinforcing the hinges with spare leather. "Water," he commanded. "We'll need water." Clara took every pot, every bucket, every tin cup, and began melting snow. She built the fire in the stove up to a roar, the metal groaning with the heat. She worked in a frantic, desperate rhythm. Melt, pour, refill. The growing stores of water in the corner were a small, tangible comfort. "The knives," he said, tossing his whetstone onto the bearskin rug. She sat and sharpened. His skinning knife, his bowie, even the small paring knife she used for vegetables. The shh of the stone on steel was a whisper of violence in the dim, hot room. They moved around each other, their bodies brushing, their hands touching as they passed tools. Each touch was a small shock, a reminder of what was at stake. Late in the afternoon, the work was done. The cabin was no longer a home. It was a fortress, a tomb. It was dark, hot, and smelled of fear. Clara was standing by the stove, her arms wrapped around herself. Elias came to her. He stood in front of her, so close she could feel the heat from his body. He just looked at her for a long moment, his eyes tracing her face in the dim, orange light from the stove's vent, as if memorizing her. "I'm scared. Elias," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know," he said. "So am I." He pulled her to him. The kiss was not the tender, healing kiss of before. It was desperate. He crushed his mouth to hers, his hands gripping her hair, her waist. It was a kiss of raw, terrifying need, a final, frantic assertion of life. He pulled back, his forehead pressed against hers. "If they come at dawn," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "If this is our last night, I want to remember it." He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled her down onto the bearskin rug, in front of the roaring fire. This time, there was no hesitation, no gentle questions. Their lovemaking was urgent, fierce, almost angry. It was a tangle of fear and desire. They tore at the wool and canvas clothes that had become their uniform. His hands were rough, his mouth demanding. She met his urgency, her nails digging into his back, her body arching to meet his. It was a coupling born not of tenderness, but of desperation. It was a frantic, wordless shout into the void. "We are here. We are alive." It was an act of defiance, a way of fighting the death that was riding toward them. Afterward, they did not sleep. They lay tangled on the furs, their bodies slick with sweat, the firelight dancing on their skin. They listened to the absolute, terrifying silence of the wilderness, waiting. As the first, faint, gray light of the false dawn filtered through the slit in the window, Elias rose. He pulled on his trousers and boots. The air in the cabin was cold, the fire having burned low. He picked up his revolver from the table. He checked the load. Spinning the cylinder, he walked over to her. Clara had pulled the fur around her, her eyes huge and dark, watching him. "You need to know how to use this," he said, his voice flat. He held it out to her. "But first," she shrank back. "No, Elias, I can't. I can't kill anyone." His face hardened. He crouched in front of her, grabbing her hand and forcing the heavy, cold metal into it. "This isn't a town debate. Clara, you're not killing anyone. You're stopping a man who means to drag you back to be shamed and broken. You're stopping a man who will kill me to get to you. This isn't murder. This is living." She was shaking, her hand trembling so badly she could barely hold the gun. "No," she sobbed. "Yes." He stood and pulled her to her feet, ignoring her nudity, his grip impersonal. He stood behind her, his body a solid wall, and wrapped his arms around her. He enclosed her trembling hands with his own, his grip like steel, forcing her to hold the revolver steady. He aimed her hands toward the barricaded door. "Your finger here," he said, his voice a low command in her ear. "You don't pull it. You squeeze it. You squeeze it slow, like you're wringing out a rag. You don't think. You don't aim. You just point at the man who is trying to hurt you, and you squeeze. Do you understand?" He made her do it, again and again. The hammer clicked, a dry, metallic sound that was a promise of the explosion to come. Click, click, click. With each pull, her trembling lessened, her hand hardening around the grip. When he was satisfied, he let her go. She sank back onto the cot, the revolver heavy in her lap, her mind numb. They waited. The dread was a physical thing, a cold sickness in the pit of the stomach. "Elias," she whispered into the darkness. He was at the window slit, his rifle resting on the wood, his gaze fixed on the tree line. I used to dream," she said, her voice small, "of just disappearing, of going so far west that the country runs out, to the ocean, a place where nobody knows my name, where I'm not the preacher's son's runaway, where I'm just Clara." He was silent for a long time. The only sound was his breathing, slow and steady. He turned his head, his profile a hard, dark line against the gray slit of light. "We'll go," he said. "Not I'd go. We'll go. When this is done, we'll pack what's left and we'll ride west. We won't stop until you see that ocean." He looked at her, his eyes finding hers in the dim light. "If you'll have me." The simple, absolute promise of a future, spoken in the face of their death, was almost too much to bear. A tear slid down her cheek. The sun was higher now. The silence was absolute. The snow had stopped falling hours ago. Their white cloak was gone. Clara stood and joined him at the window slit. They stood side by side, two soldiers at their post, and watched the tree line. She saw them first. Her hands shot out, grabbing his arm. Her fingernails dug into his skin. She didn't speak. She just pointed. "Elias!" She breathed. He was already looking. His body had gone utterly still. They were just dark shapes, moving slowly, picking their way through the deep drifts at the far edge of the clearing. 4. No, 5 riders. They were spread out, their heads down, tracking. "They're here," Elias said. His voice was flat. The dread was gone, replaced by the cold, clear calm of the scout. The waiting was over. He turned her from the window. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his grip hard, forcing her to look at him. "Listen to me, Clara. This is the only way." He spun her around and kicked at the bearskin rug. Shoving it aside, he wrenched the loose planks from the floor, revealing the small, dark square of the root cellar. It was shallow, smelling of damp earth. "Get in," he commanded. "No," she cried, pulling back. "I'll fight with you. I have the gun." "You'll die," he snarled, his face contorted. "Get in the hole. Clara, this is the only way. They want you. They think this is just some trapper's cabin. If they see you, they'll burn us out. If it's just me, they might get careless. Get in." He was frantic, shoving her toward the opening. She saw the terrifying, desperate logic in his eyes. "No matter what," he said, his voice breaking. "Do not make a sound. Do not come out. No matter what you hear. Do you hear me, Clara? No matter what." "Elias, I love you," she sobbed. "I know. Now, live." He grabbed her and kissed her. One last, hard, desperate kiss that tasted of salt and fear. "Get in." She did it, crying, shaking. She lowered herself into the cold, black hole. He shoved the revolver into her hand. No matter what. He slid the planks back into place. Darkness. She heard the scrape of the bearskin rug being pulled over her. She was alone, in the dark, with the cold earth and the gun. Above her, she heard Elias cock his rifle. She heard him move to the door. She heard him take a deep, shuddering breath. And then, from outside, a man's voice, muffled by the logs. "Hess, over here. I see a smoke plume. The cabin." The footsteps were loud now, crunching in the snow, coming closer, in the cold, damp darkness of the cellar. Clara heard the voices. They were sharp, impatient, and terrifyingly close. "I know you're in there! Trapper!" a man's voice bellowed. It was a cold, sneering sound. "We tracked the girl right to this clearing. Send her out, and we'll leave you be." Clara pressed her hands over her mouth, stifling the sob that rose in her throat. The revolver was an alien, heavy weight in her other hand. She could hear Elias, his voice a low, steady rumble, muffled by the door and the floorboards. "She was here," Elias called out. "Passed through 2 days ago. Took some food and kept moving south. She's long gone." There was a short, sharp laugh from outside. "He's lying. Hess, the tracks end here. Last chance. Old man." The first voice, Hess, shouted. "We know she's in there. We want the whore, not you. Don't die for her." Clara heard the scrape of the heavy table being moved away from the door. She heard the click of the bar being lifted. "No, Elias," she whispered into the darkness. "Don't." The door creaked open. A blast of cold air. A moment of absolute, frozen silence. Then, the world exploded. Gunfire. It was not one shot, but a deafening, rolling crash of thunder that shook the tiny cabin. It was so loud, Clara screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos. She heard the boom of Elias's Spencer, a heavy, deep thump, followed by the sharper, frantic cracks of revolvers. A man yelled, a high, thin sound of pain. Above her, the floorboards vibrated as a heavy body fell against the door. She heard Elias curse, a ragged gasp of pain. "He's hit!" a voice shouted from outside. "Rush him! Get the girl!" More gunfire. Thump! Another cry. This one cut short. Clara was shaking so violently she could barely breathe. She was clutching the gun, her finger frozen on the trigger, her mind a white blank of terror. She heard a desperate, scrambling sound, the crunch of boots on the wooden floor just above her head. Someone was in the cabin. "Find her!" Hess roared, his voice sounding just outside the door. "She's in here somewhere." She heard Elias grunt, a sound of pure, savage effort. A heavy thud. "Come on, you witch," a new voice snarled. Right above her. "Where you hiding?" The bearskin rug was ripped away. Light, blinding, gray light. A man's face, bearded, sweating, and cruel, leered down at her. His eyes widened in triumph. "Got you!" he roared. He reached down, his filthy, gloved hand grabbing her by the hair. He yanked her up, pulling her bodily from the hole as if she were a sack of flour. She screamed, the revolver falling from her numb fingers, clattering uselessly to the floor. "Look what I found! Hess!" the man bellowed, his arm locking around her throat like a band of steel. He began to drag her toward the door, her feet scrambling for purchase. "Time to face the judge! Whore!" The stench of him, stale whiskey, sweat, and gunpowder, filled her lungs. She saw Elias. He was slumped against the far wall, his left shoulder a dark, saturated mass of red. His rifle was on the floor. He was clutching his side, and in his hand was the Bowie knife. His face was pale as death, but his eyes were black pits of fire, fixed on her. The man dragging her laughed, seeing his leader, Hess, step into the doorway, his own gun raised. A fourth man, she realized, a young one, lay dead in the snow outside, his chest a ruin. Another lay half in, half out of the cabin, his revolver still in his hand. "It's over, trapper," Hess sneered, aiming his gun at Elias. "You're done." The man holding Clara tightened his grip, pulling her back against his chest as a shield. "Let's get the money and go." Clara, in that instant, stopped being afraid. The terror was burned away by a white-hot, primal rage. She would not be dragged. She would not be his money. She would not let Elias die. She twisted, her head snapping back, and sank her teeth into the man's arm. She bit down with all the strength in her body, tasting wool, salty sweat, and then the coppery tang of blood. He howled, a high, furious sound, his grip loosening in pure, shocked pain. "Why, you—" He didn't finish. Elias was no longer against the wall. He moved like a shadow, a blur of wounded, desperate speed. He was not a man. He was a wraith. He ignored Hess in the doorway. He ignored his own bleeding, ruined shoulder. He crossed the small cabin in a single, staggering lunge. He slammed into the man holding Clara, his good shoulder hitting the man's chest like a battering ram. The knife in his hand, held low, punched upward. Once, twice. The man's eyes went wide. The arm around Clara's throat went limp. He looked down, in almost comical surprise, at the dark, spreading stain on his shirt. He loosed a wet sigh and crumpled to the floor. 3 men were dead. Hess, the leader, stood in the doorway, his pistol raised, his face a mask of disbelief. He had watched his 3 men be killed in less than a minute by one bleeding man. He saw Elias swaying on his feet, his knife dripping. He saw Clara, free, scrambling for the fallen revolver. Hess was a bounty hunter, not a fool. He was here for money, not a blood feud. This trapper was something unnatural. He didn't say a word. He lowered his gun, his eyes locked on Elias. He took one slow step backward, then another, Then he turned and ran. His footsteps, frantic and heavy, disappeared into the snow. The fight was over. The cabin was silent, save for the drip, drip, drip of blood onto the floor. Elias stood for a long second, his body rigid, his head bowed. Then, as if all the strings holding him up had been cut at once, his knees buckled. He fell, his back sliding down the log wall, leaving a long, red smear. He landed heavily on the floor, the bloody knife clattering from his hand. His eyes closed. "Elias!" Clara flew to his side, skidding on the floor. "No, no, no, Elias, stay with me!" She ripped open his shirt. The wound was a nightmare, a dark, bubbling hole high in his left shoulder, where the bullet had torn through muscle and flesh. He was bleeding. He was bleeding so much. "Oh, God!" she whispered, tears blinding her. She pressed both her hands onto the wound, trying to stop the flow. The blood was hot, terrifyingly hot, and it pulsed between her fingers. "Stay with me, please, I'm begging you. Don't you leave me. Don't you dare leave me." His eyelids flickered. His good hand, his right, came up and found her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "Clara," he rasped, his voice a dry, papery sound. "I'm here," she sobbed, pressing down harder. "I'm right here. You're safe. You saved me. Did I get him?" he whispered, his eyes unfocused. "Yes," she cried, nodding, her tears falling onto his face. "You got them. They're dead. You're safe. We're safe." "Good," he breathed. He let out a long sigh, and his hand fell away. His body went limp. "No!" she screamed. "Elias!" She saw the water she had melted, the clean rags she had stacked. Her mind, frozen in terror, suddenly became sharp, clear. He had saved her. Now she would save him. She worked for hours. She didn't know how much time passed. The gray light in the cabin never changed. She tore strips from her old chemise. She boiled water, scalding the blade of the small paring knife. She held her breath, tears streaming, and dug in the wound, her hand guided by a desperate, prayerful instinct, until her fingers brushed the hot, jagged piece of lead. She pulled it out, dropping it with a clink into a tin cup. He didn't move. His breathing was shallow, his skin a waxy, pale gray. She found his small stash of whiskey. She poured it into the wound. He didn't even flinch. She packed the hole with the cleanest rags she could find, then bound his shoulder, his chest, his arm, as tight as she could, using the last of the torn cloth. She dragged him, her muscles straining, onto the bearskin rug, as close to the fire as she dared. She covered him with every blanket, every fur. She sat beside him and watched him breathe. She held his cold hand, her own covered in his drying blood, and she prayed. She prayed to a God she had cursed, a God she had fled. She prayed to his ghost, Annabelle. She prayed to the mountain. "Don't take him," she whispered, her voice raw. "You've taken everyone. You can't have him. He's mine." He lived through the night. She didn't sleep. She sat vigil, bathing his face, forcing sips of water between his cracked lips when he moaned. The next day, he woke. His eyes, when they opened, were no longer clouded. They were clear, and they were looking at her. "Hey," he whispered. Clara let out a choked sound, half sob, half laugh, and buried her face in his good shoulder. "You're alive. Hurts," he mumbled. "I know," she whispered, her tears of relief soaking his shirt. "I know." The recovery was slow. The fight had taken everything from him, but the work was not done. 3 bodies lay in their cabin. On the 3rd day, Elias was strong enough to sit, his back against the wall. Clara, her face set in a grim, hard mask she didn't recognize, did the work. She couldn't drag the men. She couldn't bury them in the frozen ground. She used the sled he kept for hauling wood. One by one, she rolled them onto it. She hauled them, her entire body screaming with the effort, to the edge of the clearing, near the deep ravine. She rolled them in. She did not look at their faces. She did not let herself think. She was just cleaning. When she was done, she returned to the cabin. The floor was stained. She scrubbed it with boiling water and lye soap until her hands were raw. Then she took the bounty poster. The paper that had brought this all down on them. She smoothed it out. Elias watched her. "Clara." She looked at him, her eyes dark, her face streaked with soot and exhaustion. "I know. More will come. Hess, he'll be back." "He will," Elias said, his voice weak but firm. "He'll bring more men. He knows I'm wounded. He knows you're here." He tried to push himself up. "You have to go, now. While you can, take my horse. Take the supplies. Ride west. Don't stop." Clara stared at him. She stared at this man, broken and bleeding. Who had killed for her, and who was now trying to send her away? "You'll die," she said, her voice flat. "If I leave you, you'll die. You can't hunt, you can't chop wood. You'll die of the fever, or you'll starve. It's better than them getting you," he rasped, his breath catching in pain. I won't see that." Clara walked across the small cabin. She knelt in front of him. She took his face in her hands, her rough, clean hands, and forced him to look at her. "Listen to me, Elias," she said, her voice quiet, but with a core of steel he had never heard. "I ran from Junction Creek. I ran from my father. I ran from them. I am done running. I will not run from you." "Clara, be smart," he pleaded, his hand finding hers. "I am being smart," she said. "You're my home. I don't have another one. You think I'm going to leave my home? You think I'm going to leave you here to die?" She shook her head. A fierce, final movement. "We leave together. Or not at all." He stared at her, at this woman he had found in the snow. This broken, terrified girl. She was gone. In her place was this person, this iron-willed partner. He saw the truth in her eyes. She would not leave. She would stay and die with him. "All right," he breathed. "Together." They left that night. They had to. Clara packed. She was ruthless. Food, salt pork, beans, flour, coffee, ammunition, all of it. Blankets, the furs, the whiskey, her clean rags. She loaded his horse, a sturdy bay that had been growing restless in the lean-to. She helped him dress. He almost passed out twice, his face gray with the pain of moving his arm. But he bit down on a piece of leather, his body shaking. She got him into his heavy coat. She loaded his rifle and his revolver. She put her own revolver, the one he had forced on her, the one she had dropped, into the waistband of her trousers. She helped him onto the horse. He slumped in the saddle, his good hand gripping the horn. She tied his bad arm to his chest, to keep it from moving. Clara looked around the cabin one last time. The stained floor, the barricaded window, the smell of blood and lye. It had been their sanctuary. It had been their battleground. She burned the bounty poster in the stove, watching until Clara Fairchild turned to black ash. Then she turned, and without looking back, she mounted the horse, sitting behind Elias, her arms wrapping around his waist to hold him steady. "Go west," he whispered, his voice faint. She kicked the horse, and they moved. They rode out of the clearing, away from the cabin, away from the shallow, unmarked graves, and into the trees. Each mile was a new kind of agony. The cold was brutal, a biting, relentless enemy. The moon was a sliver, giving them barely enough light to see. Clara's body ached. Elias, in front of her, was a dead weight. She could feel the shivers that racked his body, the fever taking hold. But she held him upright. She held on. They rode through the night, pushing the horse as fast as they dared through the deep snow. Every mile was colder. Every mile was harsher. But with every mile, Clara breathed a little easier. The air was cleaner. It didn't smell of fear. With every crunch of the horse's hooves, the ghosts of Junction Creek, the ghosts of Hess and his men, fell a little further behind. It was a cold, harsh, terrible freedom, and it was theirs, just before dawn, when Clara thought she could not go on, when she was sure Elias had passed out from the fever. She saw it, a dark shape against the snow, a small, abandoned line shack, half buried in a drift by a frozen river. It was probably just a prospector's failed dream. "Elias," she whispered, shaking him gently. Look, shelter. He stirred, his head lifting weakly. He squinted into the gloom. Good, he mumbled. Good. She led the horse to the shack. The door was off one hinge, but it was cover. Inside, it was dark, and it smelled of pack rats and old leaves, but it was out of the wind. Clara, moving with the last of her strength, slid from the horse. She helped Elias down. He collapsed against her, his entire weight on her, and together they half fell, half stumbled into the small, dark space. She lowered him to the dirt floor, propping him against the wall. She fetched the blankets from the horse, covering him. She found the matches. She broke up the one broken chair in the corner and started a small, pitiful fire in the rusted-out stove. It was not much. It was 4 broken walls and a leaky roof, but it was theirs. She sat beside him as the first gray light of dawn crept in, her body numb with exhaustion. He was asleep, his breathing ragged but steady. She had gotten him this far. She looked out the open doorway at the new, empty, Western world. They were alive. They were together. It was, she thought, a start. It was hope. They rode south for 3 weeks. They followed the spine of the mountains, keeping to the high, hidden valleys, avoiding the open plains where a man on a horse could be seen for miles. The fever broke Elias on the 4th day. Clara, moving with a grim, exhausted competence, nursed him through it in a cold, abandoned prospector's tunnel. She cleaned his wound. She hunted small game with his rifle, the sound of the shots echoing like a betrayal in the vast, empty wilderness. Elias healed slowly. The bullet had torn the muscle, and his left arm would never be as strong. But it was his. As his body mended, he watched her. The woman he had saved was gone. In her place was a partner. She was quiet, observant, and her hands, though chapped and raw, were steady. She no longer flinched at shadows. She was the one who woke at the sound of a snapping twig, the revolver in her hand before her eyes were fully open. They crossed out of Montana, through the barren high plains of Wyoming territory, and kept going south. The snows receded, giving way to brown, frozen earth, then to high desert scrub. The air grew warmer, thinner. The relentless, crushing white was replaced by a landscape of pale blue, dusty green, and burnt orange. They finally rode into the New Mexico territory, near the border of Colorado. 2 months after they had fled the cabin, they were thin, worn, and almost out of supplies. But they were alive. The town was called Agua Fria. It was not much. A collection of low, adobe buildings huddled along a dry riverbed, smelling of dust, pinon smoke, and livestock. It was a forgotten place, a stopover for ranchers and freight wagons, too far from the railroads to matter. It was perfect. They sold their horse, the last link to their old life, for $30 and a mule. They walked into the town's single, dusty inn. 2 more refugees swallowed by the West. "We're looking for work," Elias said to the innkeeper. He stood tall, his bad arm held stiffly at his side, his face gaunt. The innkeeper, a heavy man named Abarca, looked them over. He saw 100 stories he didn't want to know. He saw a man who had seen a fight, and a woman who had seen worse. "My name is John Stone," Elias said, his voice flat. "This is my wife, Sarah." Clara stood beside him, her gaze on the floor, her hands clasped. Abarca grunted. "John Stone, eh? You know horses?" "I do." Elias said, "My brother at the livery needs a hand. He pays $20 a month and a room. A small room." "We'll take it." Elias said. Clara, or Sarah as she was now, was quiet, but she was a worker. Abarca's wife, Maria, saw it. She saw the neatness of their meager belongings, the way the woman's hands, though calloused, moved with a quick, nervous energy. "Can you cook?" Maria asked. "I can bake, ma'am." Clara whispered. "The bread at this inn is a sin," Maria said, crossing herself. "You bake. I'll give you $5 a month for my own allowance. You can use the kitchen before sunrise." And so, their new life began. They lived in a tiny, whitewashed adobe room behind the livery stable. It had a dirt floor, a narrow cot, and a single, deep-set window. It was a palace. Elias, now John, spent his days in the sun and dust, his quiet, gentle way with the animals earning Abarca's grudging respect. The scar on his face and the stiffness of his arm kept the other men from asking too many questions. He was Stone, a man as quiet and hard as his name. Clara, now Sarah, rose at 4 in the morning. She moved in the dark, in the inn's big, cool kitchen, her hands finding a rhythm in the flour and the yeast. The smell of her bread, baking in the adobe horno as the sun rose, became the new smell of agua fria. Men started coming to the inn just for the bread. Maria Abarca, true to her word, paid her, and Clara held the silver coins in her hand, the first money she had ever truly earned. The townsfolk were kind. In the distant, wary way of the frontier, they were polite, but they watched. They saw the way Sarah flinched if a man laughed too loudly. They saw how she never walked anywhere without John at her side, and they saw how he, in turn, watched her, his gaze a constant, protective presence. The trauma was not gone. It was a shadow that followed her, even in the bright, hot sun. One evening, she was carrying a tray of coffee into the inn's small dining room. A group of drovers, half drunk, were telling a loud, coarse story. One of them slammed his fist on the table in a burst of laughter. Clara froze. The tray tilted. The cups rattled. The sound, the sudden male violence, sent her right back to Junction Creek. She saw the rocks. She heard the word whore. She stood there, paralyzed, her breath gone, before anyone could speak. Elias was there. He had entered from the street, silent as ever. He did not look at the drovers. He walked to her. He put his good hand on the small of her back. It was a solid, warm pressure. "It's just noise, Sarah," he murmured, his voice so low only she could hear it. "Just empty noise. You're safe." He took the tray from her trembling hands. "Go on back to the room. I'll see to this." She turned and fled, her face burning with a shame she couldn't control. He found her 10 minutes later, sitting on their cot in the dark, her arms wrapped around her knees. He sat beside her, saying nothing. He just sat, his solid, quiet presence a shield, until her shaking stopped. She began to heal, but it was slow. Her friendship with Mrs. Helen Albright helped Mrs. Albright was a widow. Her husband lost to cholera and her only son to a cannonball at Gettysburg. She was the town's unofficial seamstress and elder, a woman who had seen too much to be shocked by anything. She saw the truth in Sarah's eyes. "You have the look of a woman who has seen the elephant." "Child," the old woman said one afternoon, as they sat mending the small adobe church's altar cloths. I had a hard winter," Clara said, her eyes on her stitches. "We all have our winters," Mrs. Albright said, biting off a thread. "Some are just colder than others. The point is to be grateful for the spring." Clara began to help at the church. It was strange, being back in a place of God. At first, she flinched when the kindly, elderly priest, Father Miguel, spoke. She expected the thunder of Preacher Hollis. But Father Miguel spoke of forgiveness, of tending gardens, of the quiet dignity of work. Clara found she could scrub the church's plank floors, polish the simple silver, and feel useful. She was not a harlot. She was not a runaway. She was Sarah Stone, the woman who baked the best bread in town, the woman who helped Mrs. Albright, slowly, piece by piece. She was rebuilding her sense of worth. One night, months after they had arrived, she was sorting through the small trunk that held their few possessions. At the very bottom, folded into a tight, stiff square, was the ruined wedding dress. She pulled it out. It was a ghost. The fine lace was stiff with dried mud. The satin was stained with her own blood from the escape, and with Elias's blood from the fight. It was the last tangible piece of Clara Fairchild, the girl who had been condemned. Elias came in from the livery, smelling of horses and hay. He stopped in the doorway. Seeing her holding the dress, her face pale, she looked up at him, her eyes wide. I don't know what to do with it." He didn't speak. He walked over to her. He took the ruined garment from her hands. He looked at it for a long moment, his face grim in the lamplight. Then, he walked to the small corner fireplace they used on cold desert nights. He took the dress in his two hands, and with a grunt of effort from his good arm, he ripped it in two. The sound of the tearing satin was loud, a final, definitive severing. Clara gasped. He tossed the pieces into the cold hearth. He found the matches, struck one, and lit the fabric. The old, stained silk blackened, curled, and caught fire, burning with a bright, hot, cleansing flame. They watched it burn until it was nothing but a pile of gray-black ash. Elias turned to her. He put his hand on her cheek, his calloused thumb stroking her skin. "You don't need that to be mine," he said. It was the winter of 1889. Almost a year had passed. They had saved a little money. They were John and Sarah, respected, if quiet, members of Agua Fria. The past was a scar, but like Elias's shoulder, it had healed over. Then, the past rode into town. A traveling preacher was coming, a revival. The town was buzzing. Mrs. Albright asked Clara to help prepare the church hall for the gathering. Clara, feeling secure in her new life, agreed. She was in the hall, arranging benches, when she heard the voice. It was not the preacher for Agua Fria. This was a new voice, a voice from a nightmare. It was loud, booming, and full of a terrible, familiar righteousness. "And I say to you, the sinner shall be cast out, the liar shall be known by his fruits. The unchaste woman is a plague upon the land." Clara froze. Her blood turned to ice water. She looked toward the door. The man was tall, dressed in a severe black coat. He was older, but the face was the same. It was Silas Hollis, Gideon's uncle, the brother of the preacher who had condemned her. He was laughing, shaking hands with Father Miguel, who looked vaguely uncomfortable. Clara backed away, her hands flying to her face, a small, strangled sound escaping her throat. She stumbled, knocking over a bench with a clatter. Silas Hollis turned his head, his gaze sharp and assessing, swept over her. He looked, his eyes narrowed, and then he looked away. He didn't recognize her. How could he? The terrified, mud-stained girl in the wedding dress was gone. In her place was a thin, strong woman in a simple brown skirt, her hair pulled back, her face browned by the desert sun. She was just a servant. Clara didn't wait. She ran. She fled the church, fled down the dusty street, her heart hammering, the old panic clawing at her throat. She burst into their small room and dived under the cot, pulling a blanket over her, curling into a ball, shaking. Elias found her there an hour later. He saw her, a trembling lump in the dark. "Sarah," he said, his voice sharp with alarm. He knelt, pulling the blanket away. "Clara, what is it?" "He's here," she sobbed, her words muffled. "He's here. The preacher. The uncle. He's here." Elias went still. He helped her out, his face grim. He held her as she shook. "He didn't see you. He didn't know you. He looked right at me." She wept. He will. They'll find us. They'll never stop. We have to run. Elias, we have to run now." "No," Elias said. "What?" She pulled back, looking at him, horrified. "No." He held her by the shoulders, his grip firm. "He didn't see you. You're safe. Stay here. Lock the door." He left. He stood in the shadows of the livery, across the street from the church. He watched. He saw Silas Hollis. He saw the way the man moved, his arrogance, his predatory piety. He watched him preach, his voice full of fire and brimstone, and he felt a cold, deep rage. He stayed there, a silent guardian, until the preacher had left the church and was settled in the inn. That night, Elias took her from the room. He led her out of the town, down to the dry riverbed. The sky was a vast, open sheet of stars, bright and cold. "We can't stay," Clara said, her voice trembling. "He'll recognize me tomorrow." "I know he will." "He might," Elias agreed, his voice quiet. He knelt and picked up a smooth, dark stone from the riverbed. "And if he does, We'll run again. We'll go to Arizona or California, and we'll change our names again. We'll be David and Mary. Yes, she said, grasping at the hope. We can. And then, Elias said, maybe in a year or 5, someone else will come. Someone from Junction Creek. Someone who recognizes you, or me, and we'll run again. He stood and faced her. The starlight was bright enough to see the lines of his face, the deep, settled sadness in his eyes. Clara, he said, his voice gentle. I lived in that cabin in Montana for 2 years. I told myself I wanted to be left alone, but I was just hiding. I was a coward. I was running from Annabelle's ghost, from the men I couldn't save. It wasn't a life. It was a prison I built for myself. He took her hands. They were cold. We're doing the same thing. We're in a prison, Clara, a warmer one, with kinder people. But it's a prison. You're afraid to laugh. You're afraid to be seen. You're hiding under the name Sarah, just like I hid in those mountains. What else can we do? She whispered, her eyes filling with tears. They'll take me. They'll put me on trial. They'll hang me. No, they won't, Elias said. He tossed the stone in his hand. We stop running. We turn around. We ride back to Montana. But we don't go to Junction Creek. We go to the circuit judge. We go to the law. The real law. No, she breathed, horrified. Elias, no. They'll believe the preacher. They'll believe Gideon. Maybe, Elias said. Maybe they will. But I'll be damned if I'm going to spend the rest of my life watching you flinch at shadows, watching my wife hide in her own home. We're going to tell the truth. We're going to tell it loud. And we're going to do it together. If we keep running, Clara, we'll never be free. She looked at him, at this man who had faced 5 bounty hunters for her. He was asking her to do something even harder, to face the liars, to face the shame. She looked up at the vast, open sky. She was so tired of running. Together, she whispered. They rode north. They didn't disguise themselves. They were Elias and Clara. They rode back into the cold, back into the land that had nearly killed them both. They arrived in Bozeman, the territorial seat, in the late autumn of 1889. They found the chambers of the circuit judge, Abram Hayes. He was a hard man, with eyes that had seen everything the frontier could throw at a man. He listened, his hands steepled. Clara, her voice low and shaking at first, but growing stronger with every word, told him everything. She told him about Gideon's assault, about her father's betrayal, about the mob, the chase, the blizzard. She told him about the cabin. Then Elias spoke. He told him about the bounty poster. He told him about Hess and the 5 men. I killed 3 of them, Your Honor, Elias said, his voice clear. They came into my home to take her by force. I defended my life, and I defended hers. Judge Hayes was silent for a full minute, his gaze on Clara. He had seen women like her, and he had seen men like Preacher Hollis. A trial will begin, he said, his voice a gavel. I will subpoena Gideon Hollis, his father, and the men who rode with Hess. And you, young lady, you will give this testimony in open court. God help you. The trial was a spectacle. The small courtroom was packed. Preacher Hollis was there, his face a mask of thunderous rage. Gideon was beside him, his eyes full of a snake's confidence. Hess, the bounty hunter, was there, his face sullen. He was on trial, too. The town was divided. The whispers started again. Whore, liar, trapper's woman. Gideon's lawyer was slick. He painted Clara as a fallen woman, a violent, unchaste liar who had seduced a good man and then run when her sins were found out. He painted Elias as a half-mad mountain man. A killer, Elias testified. He was calm, clear, his words simple. He described the fight. He described the poster. He held Gideon's gaze. You sent them to kill her, he said. Then Clara was called. She walked to the stand, her steps measured. She saw Gideon smirk. She saw her father, in the back row, his face gray, refusing to look at her. She took the oath. Miss Fairchild. The lawyer sneered. Is it not true you propositioned Mr. Hollis? "No, sir," Clara said, her voice ringing out in the silent room. "He came to my room. He was drunk. He tore my dress and he struck me. He said he would take his due." "A lie! You're a liar!" Gideon shouted, leaping to his feet. "Silence!" the judge roared. "She is a liar!" Preacher Hollis boomed. "A harlot who defames my son." "Is she?" a new voice called. A woman was standing in the back. It was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "He's the liar," she said, her voice trembling but clear. My husband's son. I smelled the whiskey on him that night. I saw the scratch on his face. I held my tongue. God forgive me. I held my tongue." The courtroom erupted. Preacher Hollis turned, his face purple. "She's hysterical." "And I saw him," another voice said. A woman in a gaudy red dress stood up. "A saloon girl from Junction Creek. I saw him strike another girl just a week before, because she wouldn't go upstairs. He's a poison, that one." The dam of fear and silence that had protected the Hollis family broke. The town turned. The verdict was swift. Judge Hayes, his face grim, ruled. Gideon Hollis was found guilty of assault and of conspiracy to commit kidnapping. He was exiled from the territory, to be transported to the federal prison at Leavenworth. Preacher Hollis was censured for his part in the cover-up, his reputation in Montana destroyed. Hess, the bounty hunter, was sentenced to 5 years for armed trespass and conspiracy. Clara's name was cleared. She sat in the witness chair, her hands in her lap, tears streaming down her face. Elias walked to her. He didn't speak. He just held out his good hand. She took it. They stood, and, holding hands, they walked out of the courthouse. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of awe, respect, and shame. Clara walked out into the cold, bright Montana sunlight, and for the first time in her life, she felt truly free. They did not stay in Bozeman. They did not go back to Junction Creek. They rode back into the Beartooth Mountains, to the valley that Elias knew. They did not go to his old cabin. The place was tainted with blood and ghosts. They found a new spot, a high meadow by a clear, fast-moving stream. That spring, they built their own cabin. They built it together. He felled the trees, his left arm still weak, but his right strong. She helped him strip the bark and notch the logs. They chinked it with mud and moss, their hands, side by side, pressing the earth into place. It was a good cabin, small but solid, built not for hiding, but for living. The next winter came. It was cold, the snow deep and clean. Elias was outside, chopping wood, the clean, sharp thwack of the axe echoing in the silent, clear air. He looked up. Clara had come to the doorway of their new home. She was barefoot, standing in the snow, a small smile on her face. The cold didn't bother her. Elias stopped his work and walked to her. He took off his heavy wool coat, the one he had lent her so long ago, and wrapped it around her shoulders. Pulling her close, she looked up at him, her gray eyes clear and full of a love as vast as the mountains. "I came for one night," she whispered. Elias leaned down and kissed her forehead. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, the smell of wood smoke and bread all around them. "You gave me a lifetime," he replied. "Thank you so much for listening to our story. We truly hope it brought a little piece of the Old West into your day. We would be honored if you'd let us know where in the world you're listening from. Please drop a comment in English. And if you enjoyed this tale, consider subscribing to From Wild West for more stories just like this one. We'd love to hear your thoughts on Clara and Elias's journey.